to start with some information that you might know, but that I will just remind you of. So we are talking about equity and inclusion in the economics classroom. Currently, if we look at it in terms of gender, there are about 30% of the econ majors are women. And we know that at this point in time, women have surpassed men in terms of degrees earned. Also, the 30% in economics is less than in the social sciences overall, it's less than in business, and it's less than in the STEM fields. And if we just pull out math, generally, women represent about 45% of math majors and still 30% of econ majors. And that's, for the last 30 to 40 years, it's been relatively constant. So what we are going to focus on today, and I'll just give you sort of a rough bullet outline, not of our presentation, but of strategies. So the strategies here are to try to increase the representation of women and of historically underrepresented populations, but not just to increase diversity, to really increase inclusion. So we need to change the culture, change the environment, change how we are understanding or at least representing the field in all of its breadth or all of its narrowness, whatever it might be. So some of those strategies in terms of what research shows is that women tend to be more interested in, and also students from underrepresented populations tend to be more interested in economics as a social science. So when we cover things like inequality and immigration and discrimination and homelessness and food insecurity and things like that. Research also indicates that these populations are also interested in more applied economics, so more current issues and current events. Not that women are atheoretical or theoretically incompetent, but they're more theory with a purpose. Where is this going? Is it going to help us solve a problem? Is it getting us somewhere? Or is it more just an intellectual, abstract exercise? Also, research indicates that pedagogy matters and that we need to pay attention to it, even though we think that it might be neutral. It typically isn't, so we'll be looking at that. Research also indicates, and I kind of implied it, that math is not the issue, that women's skills going into college are equivalent to men's skills. The only thing that we might see is that women might not be as confident in their quantitative skills as men are. As such, they might not see economics as a field for them if they equate economics with math. So it kind of introduces a stereotype threat there. But women also tend to enter economics through psychology, whereas men, if they find their way into economics, tend to find their way through business or engineering. So it's a different kind of a pull that we need for economics, and something like behavioral and experimental are more of a draw than other things that we might focus on. Instructor behavior in the classroom matters. And that is both our conscious and our unconscious behavior that we'll be talking about. And in fact, that's where we will start, and we'll start with Katie.
Okay, thank you, Claire. So I was doing some work with a colleague, this was last year, on gender differences in the workplace, and this idea of implicit bias kept coming up, and I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with this concept. Implicit bias is based on implicit social cognition. So it's those thoughts, those feelings that we have that are outside of our conscious awareness, outside of our conscious control. There's a lot of data out there and studies that show us that implicit bias does impact us on a daily basis, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's with our students in the classroom. So I'm going to give you a couple quick examples really quickly just to show you. These are some of the ones that really stuck with me and the work that I've been doing. So there was one study where the teachers scored a set of math tests with the names redacted, so no names attached to the test, and the females outscored the males. They then put the names back on the assignments, rescored them, and now the males outscored the females. So it was flip-flopped. The interesting thing about that is all of the teachers were female. So, there's obviously some sort of bias going on there. Or, as Claire mentioned earlier, females make up nearly 60% of college students in the United States, but professors are still more likely to call on male students. That's just the way that it is. So I'd highly encourage you guys, when you leave today, do a quick Google search for, it's called Project Implicit. Has anyone taken those tests before? Okay, so some of you guys have. If not, you can just Google Project Implicit Harvard. You're going to go to a page. There's going to be many different tests that you can take to try and pick up on your own biases. The one I'd start with is the gender career. That's the one I started with. There have been some critiques about the science behind these tests, how accurate are they on picking up on our biases, but that's not what I was concerned with. I wasn't concerned with identifying my biases to 100% accuracy. I just wanted to be introspective and, start a conversation with myself and start a conversation with my colleagues. So when I took the gender career test, it actually showed that I did have a bias. It showed that I had a slight association with females in the home and with the male gender in the workplace. And I got the results and I'm like, what? This can't be. I'm a feminist. I think that women can do anything that men can do, even in the field of economics. And my husband actually took the same test and showed zero bias, which he continues to hold over my head. So I don't know if the tests are valid, but it caused me to start examining my behavior on a daily basis. I'm so much more conscious of how I interact with my students. Who am I calling on? How am I talking to them? What is the message that I am trying to get both the males and the females in my classroom? What am I trying to get at? So I'm going to give you a quick story to kind of show you how this has manifested itself in my classroom. So I generally have a pretty easy classroom, laid back. You don't have to raise your hands. I encourage debate. I like talking about controversial subjects. But sometimes these type of classrooms, it's going to be easiest for the most confident students, and it's going to be easiest for the loudest students to be the ones who are being heard. So after kind of focusing on my own implicit biases, I started paying attention to the other students who previously, kind of went under the radar. I didn't notice. So the first semester after kind of doing this work, I noticed a student in the back. Her name was Rachel. She was very soft-spoken, a good student, scored good on the exams, good on the test, never participated, very meek, as I said, very soft-spoken. So one day I was giving a lecture and I could tell she was really into what I was saying. You guys know that feeling? The students are looking at you, they have that intense look, like they're following you all over the room. So I just walked over to her and I'm like, hey Rachel, it looks like you're really enjoying this lecture. Do you have anything that you'd like to add? And she contributed. And the important thing there is that I walked over to her. Because prior to, this journey that I've been on, I was one of those teachers that didn't even pay attention to where I was in proximity to my students. So if you're in the back of the room and you ask me a question and I don't hear you, I'm going to say, what? So you're going to repeat yourself. Sometimes I'm not going to hear you the second time. I'm going to say, what? And then make a joke about how I'm old and I can't hear. But in retrospect, looking back, there's no quicker way to shut down a student who's already feeling not as confident as some of the others, is telling them that when you're answering my questions, you're not doing it in the right way. Okay, so I started walking over to the students, getting closer to them. I started just paying extra attention. She's just one student, there's many of them, leaving comments on their papers like, I value your voice, your contribution is valid, keep up the good work, keep contributing. And I saw specifically this one student just kind of blossom throughout the semester. And she came up to me at the end, and I know this is just anecdotal and it's not scientific, and thanked me for the great learning experience. So I really feel, again, I don't have any assessment data. I'm currently working on that to try and show how my actions are actually causing my students to do better. But just in the interactions I've had with the students, I feel it. You guys are instructors. You assess your class on a daily basis. You're always looking for feedback from your students. And I know that my class is now like a safer and more welcoming space for a segment of the population who previously I was not serving. Not because I was intentionally not serving them, but I had my own preconceived notions about what a good student was and what a good student should be. So that's really made a big impact in my classes.
Thank you. And just to follow up a little bit on that, in terms of looking at the unconscious bias, it typically comes out with in our body language. So it's something that we want to be, I don't know that you can strategize about your body language, but you might be able to. So for example, eye contact is important because we would tend to students that might not fit what a typical really good student looks like, we might not make eye contact with them. So if you make a concerted effort to make eye contact with our students, especially students who have their hands raised, that also registers who they are in our mind a little bit more clearly, and we follow up. Because if we don't follow up with the third student that raised their hand and had a question, typically it will be that student that's invisible to us for a variety of different reasons. So we should have a strategy about our eye contact. You should also have a strategy about how you're going to call on students. It could be random, but just make it a strategy every third student, and you can change your strategy every time, so that you know that you're not calling on students because of some unconscious bias that you might have. So just arbitrarily decide on a strategy that might be better than what you're might be currently doing. And proximity of the instructor is important. So not only are students, in back of the room, and we might also have preconceived notions about who sits in back of the room, which complicates things even further. But the stakes are pretty high. When you have to ask a question, the entire class turns around to look at you. So if we get closer to our students, they're more apt to ask questions, and they're asking the question of you. And if you're closer, it reduces those stakes.
Yeah, so I teach very large, well, not compared to Jose, but my classes are pretty large. They're 230 for my principal's courses, mostly first years and a few scattered seniors. And so I've been thinking about this proximity issue and thinking about how to reduce distance, right? And how to democratize discussions, which can never really perfectly happen in a large classroom. But I want to segue into talking about technology, because technology for me has been a godsend, I think, for my large classes. And the way that I am trying to continue to improve that sort of, remove the distance between them and me, remove the stereotyped threat for women in the classroom, especially if they're, it's a male-dominated classroom, is to use iClickers, and I've used other ones as well, but iClickers are what I'm currently using, and there's something about, so what you all are talking about with the introverts and the historically underrepresented people that might have some imposter syndrome going on, they're not going to be the ones that answer or that ask questions. And so what Jose's talking about with using iClickers as motivation, I think really works for an inclusive space as well, right? So putting forth, hopefully, not just dumb questions to them, not just sort of, boring, low-level Bloom's taxonomy questions, but questions that actually engage them. Maybe there's opinion questions. These, even with multiple choice questions, there's a whole lot we can do to sort of reach out and pull something engagement from our students. And plus, we remove the first mover advantage when we put a question out there rather than saying, who wants to discuss it? And usually it's the loudest, most extroverted male students, white students that answer first, at least in my experience. And so there's something to be said for, and this doesn't have to be technology. I don't want to sort of specify that it's always technology. You can do it with like just a quick minute paper as well. But getting them to reflect on a position, even if they don't share it out, automatically increases inclusion and engagement, I think, because they feel like they have been part of the conversation, even if their voice hasn't actually been heard audibly. Somebody cared enough to ask them what they thought about something. So I think there's that sort of, for me, in my large classes, the iClickers have been something that I've tried to use for engagement. And of course, you have to be careful, like I said, about your questions. If all your questions are, Bobby bought 3 baseballs last week, and it's going to be, I think we have to be careful about the names and the applications that we're using, if we care about inclusivity in the classroom, because we want them to see themselves, right? And what Betsy, I thought, said was great about when it's too abstract and when it's too distant from their daily lives, that there's not as much learning that happens. So I use iClicker and definitely use the peer-to-peer discussions that Jose had us do. And I think I'm hoping that it flattens and democratizes the classroom somewhat, even a large classroom. So I think in terms of the instructor behavior and in terms of technology and like what I would call the environmental aspects of the class, we can, as instructors, even if our classroom is really not set up for active learning, there's things we can do to engage all the voices in the room. And I think instructor behavior and technology are 2 of those things.
So technology for me, I've really been focusing on improving and using technology in my online classes, because I feel like the traditional online class is designed for a specific type of student, right? The type of student who can basically teach the material to themselves. So over the past 3 years, I put a lot of work into my online classes, and I've done a lot of different things. I'd be happy to talk about this later on if you're interested, but I'm just going to share the one idea that I feel I got the most bang for my buck. So for every one of my online classes, I do what I call them Monday messages. So I have my laptop in my office, and every Monday I create a personalized video for each of my online classes. I'm currently teaching 3, so it gets a little time consuming. So I go over any problems that I saw in the previous week. So I pull up the quiz statistics, I look at the discussion post, where were the issues, I talk about it. And then I outline what is going to be on the schedule for the upcoming week. So I'm introducing the content to the students, and I'm telling them specifically what you have to do and when you have to do it. Sometimes I tell jokes, sometimes I'll read a headline from the news, sometimes I sneak in extra credit because I'm kind of curious who's actually watching my videos. But I found that this has been a great way of making my online class more inclusive, specifically for those students who traditionally struggle. I teach at a community college. We have a lot of non-traditional students. I don't know if that would apply to many other people in this room, but for us, I have a lot of students who work full-time. So they might not be the best online student, but that's the only option they have. So it's my job as a teacher to, how can I make this course work for you? So that's been successful for me as well.
Right, and the data does show actually that the equity gaps grow if we look at the online environment and compared it to the on ground. I'm actually right in the middle here, and that is because on ground I have not worked well with technology. I have nothing against technology, but when I use it, so for example, you see, Jose up here, and it seems like, wow, I can do the eye clickers. That looks really cool. That could be me, but maybe not. Or when you saw Eric Chang up here and you're like, whoa, I can do that to my PowerPoints. I can make them really dynamic. That could be me, but it's not me. And there's no issue with that, but when I've tried it, I've always sort of run up against the technology. Somehow it gets in my way. So I just want to put that out there. In terms of the online, I do use technology. I teach an online class over the summer, and I do use technology to kind of try to humanize that environment in the same way that you do. But the other thing that we kind of mentioned is one of the hooks, at least for underrepresented populations in economics, was behavioral econ. So I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah, so I'll say a few things about behavioral economics, because I think some of the themes that speakers have covered in the last couple of presentations are really useful and I think supportive of behavioral economics. For me, like I said, I teach primarily principles of macro, but I've got micro sometimes, and I do this poverty, discrimination, immigration class. So especially with that poverty, discrimination, immigration class, it's very clear that we need to have a good model of decision making, well, as good as we can, of a model of decision making, so students can see themselves. Again, it's that abstraction of the super rational, self-interested creature that never makes errors in judgment that I think for me would be a big turnoff, right? And so students can see themselves so much more clearly, and I'll make the case for why I think this is inclusive. Not only is it engaging, which I think behavioral economics is, because they immediately recognize, oh yeah, we're sort of designed to procrastinate. We're designed not to do good decisions when the costs and benefits aren't present at the same time. We're designed to there's these predictable errors, right, that we have in our decisions. But when we think about, and I'll use gender inclusivity here, when we think about bandwidth taxes and the effect of the extra care that women have to use for safety, often choose to use for appearance, and sometimes I'll even do this in my class. I'll take a quick survey with iClares. How much time do you spend on your appearance today? How much time did you think about making your way across campus that night? And it's pretty clear there's a difference, right? So if we put that into context of decision making and the extra sort of cognitive load that's placed on females, and we could make the case that not all females have that, but that's neither here nor there at this point. Usually it opens up a really good discussion, right? So we have, to me, I have queer students in class, and sometimes they'll be talking about how much time they manage they have to spend managing their relationships and their sort of protecting themselves in the college campus. And so I think that they can imagine, or they can place themselves within economics so much more easily when we remove the abstraction, or at least remove some of the abstraction by bringing in behavioral and psychological economics earlier on. And so I know we've sort of played around with this idea of should we introduce market power early? When should we sort of introduce the real world and remove this toy abstract world? And what's a better way to do it? And so I guess I'm coming down on the side of, at least for behavioral, let's bring it in early, because I think that really engages people. Plus, you're talking about psychology, and that's often more interesting than marginal revenue curves, speaking for me at least. And then, so we can have this discussion also of it's not just inclusive to women. Clearly, when we talk about the errors in our rationality, we're also talking about ways that students can now see how metacognition might be important for them. They might see that their strategies for learning have predictably poor consequences because of I've helped them identify where their system 1 or system 2 brain is working at the wrong time. And anyway, not getting into the weeds, but sort of the removing guilt, allowing them to think about how our brains do a good job and when they don't do a good job, I think helps a lot of people, especially students that might be working full-time or might be first-generation students. They're definitely feeling this stuff the most. And I think we do disservice if we imagine that our students are all rich white kids, which happens to be who I teach, but increasingly not that way. I think we have to be, it really serves everybody. And what's good for women and what's good for underrepresented minorities is good for everybody, right? We all face scarcity at some point in our lives, and we all have this sort of not enough time, not enough whatever. And so I think behavioral economics really helps. And then talking about fixed and growth mindset sort of as framing, helping students, especially women or whoever who might feel like they're just not a math person, sort of breaking that down and seeing where that comes from and strategies to overcome that. So the fixed and growth mindset, I think you can really talk about that pretty quickly and show them a video, even give them an assignment outside of class that really helps reinforce or enforce if they've seen it before, a little more persistence, right? And a little more, less threatened by failing at first, right? Which is what we want, which is, as we've, I think, looked at in Econ Ed, is failure happens, right? It's just part of economics. So what do we do with that? And Jose said, I'm here to help them to be that person when they fail, what happens next, right? So I think that's a point that we could step into power more in that area. And did you want to say anything about behavioral?
Maybe just briefly, I tend to use it right at the beginning of my classes as part of a larger module on ways of thinking and knowing, because I tend to have that thinking and knowing stream running throughout my classes. And so I'll put that in there, and I probably use mostly O'Reilly in there, and come back to cognitive limitations when maybe they're studying for an exam. And I'll come back to that in terms of they expect themselves to know it without studying, without reading, without practice, and so they're kind of not paying attention to that. So the other recommendation that I might have with this is some of the videos and the resources that you mentioned. You can also put them up. I don't know if any of you are using Canvas, but on that home page, you can continually change the video that you might have on the home page. And so students are getting the information, but it's not necessarily an assignment. And I do that. I change it every week. And I don't know that everyone's looking at the videos, but sometimes students will refer to that information in class, or at least some of them are. So before passing it over to Katie, and talking a little bit about Econ as a social science, I just want to share a couple of experiences that I've had as an instructor. So one thinks, all right, so let's just move into econ as a social science. So I was at Cal Poly. I was Selena's colleague for 18 years, but we're teaching in a college of business. And so economics as a social science is pretty much makes you a sociologist, not an economist. And so when I would teach poverty, discrimination, and inequality, it would be the first time that students were seeing inequality, first time they saw poverty, first time they saw discrimination, first time they saw immigration. So the way that that was reflected back on me is, you must not be an economist, because you're the only one doing this. And so that was sort of negative feedback that I was getting. So I always felt like I was operating somewhat in a bit of a hostile environment, because what the students were accustomed to and how econ was defined by most of my colleagues. So it's not always like an easy thing, let's transition. So then I transitioned to Santa Monica College, and I'm in a department of social science, so all safe there, right? And I can teach the very same things, and their reception is, which I say, much greater. But one afternoon, I had to take over a colleague's class because he was going to be out of town. He's a sociologist. So I went into his sociology class, and I was shocked. It was like 98% women. So even though here we are in econ teaching it as a social science, women are still all migrating over to sociology because they think if you want to change the world, you don't go to econ, you go to sociology. And so I think we need to flip that thinking.
I've always spent a lot of time in my classes doing the real world application, so focusing on these problems. Most of the students I teach, they're going to do principles of micro, macro, and that's done. So I've always been conscious of how do I make my course valuable to them? How can I make this serve them in their future life? So I've always talked about things like, inequality, talked about immigration, talked about the gender pay gap. But I've tried to change it up a little bit over this past year and try to think more on a local level as to what will interest my students. So Lakeland College is in Illinois, and as I'm sure you know, Chicago is also in Illinois, and Chicago has a little bit of a crime problem, specifically on the south side. So this is an issue that is relevant to the people who live in my state. And because it is a community college, the students who I'm teaching, most of them grew up in the state of Illinois. So I was trying to think of a way that I could, take this real world event that they care about, that is important to them, how can I incorporate that into my class? So I looked around for different resources and found a great one by the BBC where an interviewer goes, stays on the south side, interviews these individuals in these communities, talks about their life, how did they grow up, why are they making the decisions that they are making now, what led to that, why do you carry a gun while at the same time decrying violence in your communities? And I thought that this would be great to work into when I talk about behavioral economics. And we talk about why do humans make the decisions that they make. So it led to a great discussion with my students, and it kind of pushed them to challenge the way that they were thinking. So not only are we looking at something that is relevant to them, but my college, even though we share a state with Chicago, we are not Chicago. We are 3.5 hours south. Students always make a joke that we're located in the middle of a cornfield, because we are. So when we started this assignment, the students had kind of preconceived notions as to what was causing the crime issues in Chicago. It's the people, it's their culture, there's nothing that we can really do about it. And after we go through this and analyze it with an economic framework, they come away from it feeling very different. And so I challenged them to kind of come up with some outside of the box ideas. What are some things that we could do to give people an incentive to change their behavior? So that's one example of trying to focus on something local that my students care about. As I mentioned, it's a rural community, so I don't thank Donald Trump for nearly anything except for his trade war, only because my students like to talk about it in the classroom, because they are farmers. They see how this is impacting their families. So that's another example of where I'm still talking about the theory. I'm still teaching the things I need to teach, but I'm making more time for real world application, because this is what makes economics relative to more students in my classes. And I find that they enjoy the course more, and I find that these are the things that they remember. So not necessarily the textbook, but how to apply the textbook theory.
Okay, and I don't know how many of you might use OER resources, open educational resources, but those of you that might, you have an opportunity to revise the chapters or revise a resource, and some of that revision might include updating it to have some of the local information if your students tend to be more locally based, which tends to be an inclusive practice. So, and speaking of inclusive practices, we're going to move on to sort of inclusive pedagogical practices.
Okay, so there's, we're still figuring out why women are not more present in the field of economics, and there's all sorts of theories, all sorts of studies going on. So I'll focus more on just inclusivity in general. All right, so course design. Are there things we can do that that scare fewer people away from being econ majors? We'd actually, I think most of us like to see more econ majors in the world, right? So how do we do that? I have come so I started teaching in 1995, and that was, I still think, we could all make the point that the lecture model is still fairly dominant, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And I'll say something provocative here. Is it malpractice if we have enough research now that says that active learning is more effective for more students and we're still primarily lecturing? I'll let you chew on that, or maybe we should all chew on that. But let's move on. Because there's so I think one of the big pushbacks, and I feel it in myself, is I love to tell stories and I love to lecture. And I really like, in my 230-person class, I love sort of handling that, channeling that energy, right? So I fall back into the lecture model all too often. I will readily admit that. However, even if we don't forego the lecture model entirely, or we decide to do a mix of active learning and lecture, which is kind of what I end up doing, the things that seem to work, lot of low-stakes formative, non-threatening questions, right? So some of you do clicker questions and have them be extra credit, or I do clicker questions and have them be, a minimal part of the grade. Peer-to-peer interaction, adaptive quizzing before they come to class. That's credit, no credit. These things are shown, at least for women, to increase persistence, simply because women in stereotype threat have we think less persistence, because if they get negative grades early on in economics, that they're pretty sensitive to that, right? At least more than male students. And so a way to sort of reduce the cost of failure, I think, is really important for women, for underrepresented students, for anybody that's first generation or is working full time. The cost can be higher, especially when imposter syndrome's engaged. So lots of low-stakes formative quizzes. I think, obviously, we have to do summative, sort of higher stakes stuff as well. But if you build in early on sort of the expectation of failure and of ways to come back from failure, we've done a lot. So if I could suggest just one tweak, if you're not already doing it, and maybe you are, is to do more low-stakes formative stuff. In my class, I don't even necessarily grade them. And I love this about the sort of the flip it econ model, where, and Jose showed us sort of justify your answer, write down an answer, right? Like, so you answered that it was love or water or whatever, right? Why did you say that, right? Because as Bill Goff knows, we have like misperceptions or preconceptions about economics are sometimes very hard to unseat. So having students face those assumptions and preconceptions that they have is something that I think is hugely important. So we can do that with iClickers, we can do that with our formative quizzes, we can do that sort of as a way to, I think, to make the tent, to make it less scary to stay in the economics classroom, along with engagement. So I think course design does matter.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, not about course design, but about certain strategies, mostly active learning. So I was coming from Cal Poly, which was a predominantly white institution, predominantly male in terms of econ. And when I moved over to Santa Monica College, I have only 27% of the students are white, largely Latinx dominated. and also a lot more first generation college educated and a lot more low-income students. So when I walk into my classroom, it looked very different than the classroom that I had left at Cal Poly. So it might be the case that when you walk in, when students are so underrepresented and you don't address inclusion, that you think, oh, well, how many people can be hurt? Like 2? You might think that and dismiss it. But when you walk into a much more diverse classroom, it's like, no, actually, 60% of my students, so you feel like you have to do something. So one of the issues that I have to address or I'm trying to address, is that there is really a cultural capital gap between my students. Some students come in and they really know how to learn, they know what they're supposed to do, they know how to be successful in the educational environment. And other students come in not knowing that. And the fact that they're in an econ class actually exacerbates those differences. So one thing with active learning is that if you bring the learning into the classroom and do more of a learn by doing approach, and it doesn't have to be every day and it doesn't have to be every class, it can be a module, it can be a certain topic that you cover. But when you bring it into the class, typically what you would do is you would do the most difficult material in class. So things that they're having trouble with are what you're helping them navigate in the classroom. So while you're helping them navigate, you're actually building that cultural capital. This is how we do it. This is how we apply it. This is how we use our notes effectively. This is what we mean by application. This is how I would study the material. Now, I'm not saying any of this, right? We're just modeling it all because that's what we're doing. And so it sort of increases the information that students that don't know how to be successful in that environment will have when they go home. Now, when they go home, they are reading the textbook or doing other prep materials. Not to say that the textbook is not that important, but studies kind of show that students don't actually read the textbook all that often. Students might not buy the textbook, and if they do read the textbook, they might not be reading it carefully enough. So I would rather, Macmillan doesn't want me saying that, I would rather them be doing that on their own, because that difference between what they're extracting from that is smaller than the difference of the more difficult stuff. So kind of the learn by doing and bringing it into the classroom. The other, I'm a storyteller too. And so I think that's part of the lecture that I like, or that's part of the lecture I've kind of maintained, but it has to be strategic storytelling. It's not just a tangent, because that's not useful. It needs to be information that you want students to get, and this is your way of conveying that information. So I do it mostly around economic history and history of economic thought, because that's less available to them. And so things, and I do it in really like small chunks. Like you might be doing something on the financial crisis, and you don't have to do the entire financial crisis, but this is what it meant for Bear Stearns to default, and you tell a story about that. This is what it meant this is what the housing market crash looked like. This is what happened to wealth. This is what happened to people just like you. This is what happened to pensions. So just, you stop at different moments and you tell them the story so that the higher theoretical stuff that you're doing I guess fits a little bit better into the reality. You might add some history of thought, like you can, if you're doing, what do we mean by technology? What do we mean by invention? What do we mean by innovation? When we talk about increasing this, when we talk about, productivity. You might introduce history of thought there, a little bit like everyone loves Schumpeter, right? Waves of creative destruction, but they don't necessarily know who it's tied to, so you can tie it to, a particular individual in the course of that storytelling. So they're getting information.